What does self-control mean? What can it mean? And how can we use Alexander technique to form a healthier relationship with the idea of self-control? This is Open Mind Alexander technique. I'm Jess. Today we're getting a bit conceptual. One of the things that I hear sometimes from people who have heard about Alexander technique but haven't really studied it themselves is that it has something to do with you need to have good posture and have really strong self-control. You're not completely wrong, but that's not why. What's missing there is what do we mean by self-control? And what are some ways that I think the Alexander technique world throughout English-speaking language history of the last 100 to 120 years, I think has actually done a disservice to itself. So the three components of Alexander technique, as I describe them, is becoming aware of what's happening, preventing what you don't want, and encouraging what you do want. That's my phrasing. There are terms for that. The original terms were developed more than 100 years ago, more than 4,000 miles away from where I live, in a different culture, different context. And with those gaps, I think that the verbiage needs an update. The original terminology for those three components was awareness, inhibition, and direction. Now, I use two of those three, awareness, because that's a word that we still use quite a bit, awareness of yourself, awareness of what's happening. And I also use direction. I use direction in the context of a direction is any helpful thought that helps you organize yourself. And I also use it as a verb. You are directing yourself when you are using those cues and those tools to improve your organization of yourself. But that middle one, inhibition, is the relevant one here. And it's the word inhibition that I think needs an update quite a bit. In the US, today, this is in 2025, if my students who are university level students who are, these are highly educated people, mostly coming from fairly privileged backgrounds where they have access to the lifestyle that can send them to a pretty high-level private university like this, they don't really know what inhibition means. That's not a word that they've got in their vocabularies for most of them. And if they do have that word, the way that they've heard it, the context that they associate with it is it means being repressed. Right? You're a very inhibited person. That means that you're timid, that you're holding yourself back in a lot of ways. And that is so not what is intended by this. It is certainly true that we can adapt the meaning of words as we want to. Language is totally, a social construct. It's all made up anyway. It's sounds that we ascribe meaning to. Why not change that meaning? In this case, I feel like we're better off updating the terminology and the jargon to something that fits and is more intuitive for the students that we're actually working with. So, what inhibition means today and meant then, ideally, is not holding yourself back or being a very repressed, closed-off person. It's more about being able to prevent a habitual response from going through. It's being able to put a little roadblock and say, no, stop, wait. I'm inhibiting that response. I'm taking a second to breathe, check in with myself, and then I will go. That's what it's supposed to mean. I don't think that the word carries that weight at this point, at least not here. So that's why I don't use it. That is very relevant for this idea of self-control. There is a pretty strong kind of social movement in the US right now in particular of this idea of you should be able to say anything that you want. There should never be any consequences because if you hold people accountable, that's cancel culture, right? That nonsense, which is used very strongly by people who are in positions of power in order to silence opposition and say, oh, well, you can't say that to me because you're canceling me. I should be able to say whatever I want with complete impunity. Maybe self-control is part of that equation. I think that over time, especially here in the US, a lot of people have developed this understanding of the idea of self-control as honestly being kind of a negative thing. It means that you are somehow like held back or like weaker than the people who just are very passionate and they go for whatever they want the second they want it, with no regard for consequences or consent from other people or various other things. That we live in a society, it's not all about you. We do need to communicate about these things. It is important. I propose that working with Alexander technique in a more updated context is a great tool for learning self-control as a positive thing. For some people, self-control is pushing themselves to speak up more. For some people, self-control is not overworking. I would argue for most people that come in here to work with me, that is the aspect of self-control that we work on, and I do phrase it in that way. For many people, especially in a school like this it's largely a classical music school specifically, so I'm working mainly with classical musicians. There is such a strong culture of bear down into it and make sure you get it right, because there's going to be 200 people applying for that one symphony position and you have one shot, and if you are anything less than perfect, you have absolutely no chance, because the top 10 people all will be technically flawless in every way, and you have to figure out a way to distinguish yourself in an audition setting from perfection. That mentality and that reality of what it takes in order to get these jobs, to be able to actually have a career in this, can really lead to people holding themselves in a lot. And it can kind of perpetuate this idea of like, if you're not suffering for your art, you're not doing it hard enough. You're not working hard enough, you're not trying hard enough. Bear through all those rehearsals. Work through the fact that you're expected to be in rehearsals and performances until 10 or 11 at night, and then you might have 8 a.m. classes the next morning. That's music school right now. It's very difficult, and it is not something that I think should be expected of human beings. It contributes to this culture of just push yourself more. Push harder, work through pain, work past any of the issues that were coming up, rather than learning moderation, learning to rest, learning to not overwork. Just yesterday, I was working with a student who's a violinist, and what he discovered is that he had been thinking he needed to be here while he was playing, and he had no idea that's what he was doing. It's just doing this was his mental concept of being upright and like sitting up straight while playing seated, which he needs to do for orchestra. So he's in that position for 6 hours a week of rehearsals, minimum, way more than that during opera week. And once I pointed that out and helped him work with coming up and out, widening in his back, letting himself breathe, I had to prove with multiple sets of pictures, I promise you are not slouched forward. You're just really used to overwork. You're used to squeezing your shoulder blades back and down, tightening in your back, and that's just what you've been used to doing while playing, and that has influenced your idea of what is required in order to play, without you realizing that that's what's happened. I think it's a really strong example of this idea of overwork, and work culture in the United States in particular is so out of hand. Humans don't need to be doing that. It's not healthy. What I encourage instead for my students, and what I propose to all of you on ye internet, reconsider what self-control can mean. Perhaps self-control is about setting boundaries. Perhaps self-control is something that lets you be more creative, because you're not spending extra energy in ways that you don't need to on things that are unnecessary. Whether those things are in a physical muscular sense of controlling muscle groups in overworking ways, or in a more figurative and social sense of saying yes to things that maybe you shouldn't have said yes to, or not being able to say yes to what you would like to say yes to. So what I would encourage all of you to consider is the meaning of self-control, and can we kind of adapt? Control of myself does not have to be a negative thing. And I don't have to engage with this cultural idea that any type of self-control is somehow cancel culture and we need to be afraid of it because of those people over there. It's nonsense. Working with the use of ourselves as a whole self, not just mind and body as separate pieces, but one whole human, can be a very helpful and healthy way to engage with ourselves and the world around us.